Next witness will be Jeff Anderson, Your Honor. And at this time, I was going to introduce a few of the exhibits that Coffee just talked about. Which would be plaintiffs number 5, plaintiffs 53, plaintiffs 161, plaintiffs 162, and plaintiffs 165.
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, we need the court will admit 5, 53, 161, 162, and 165.
So help you God?
I do. Watch your step, have a seat, speaking aloud with your voice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Jeff Anderson. I'm the Director of Valuation and Analytics at Consor Intellectual Asset Management, for a firm that for the last 26 years has specifically focused on the valuation of intellectual property.
Okay, and what do you do for a living?
For a living, I value intellectual property. So we not only value it, but we monetize it. And when I say monetize, that means generate income, revenue, value from intellectual property, whether that's through licensing, sale, or purchase.
Can you tell the jury about your educational background, please?
Sure. I got the undergraduate degree from Santa Clara University, studied economics there. I went to get a master's degree and MBA in finance from San Diego State University.
And are you a member of any professional organizations?
I am. So I'm a member of LIMA, it's the Licensing Industry Merchandisers Association. I'm also a member of LES, the Licensing Executive Society, which I'm also the co-chair of a new technology branding and trademark licensing committee. I'm a member of INTA, it's the International Trademark Association, and I believe that's it.
Do you teach other people about how to value intellectual property?
I do. So we teach CLEs, continuing legal education seminars, to attorneys and valuation experts, specifically on how to value intellectual property. We also, I believe, are one of the only firms to ever present and teach to the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, on how to value intellectual property, including websites.
And when you say valuing intellectual property, what types of things are you talking about?
So we value all different types of intellectual property. So intellectual property could be trademarks, copyrights, patents, trade secrets, websites, databases, that sort.
How many websites have you valued?
I valued probably 3 to 5 different websites in my career.
And in valuing different types of intellectual property, are the same methods typically employed?
Sure. So with any intellectual property asset, you have the same basic tools that you can use to value any of those intellectual properties. Now, the tools that you're going to use, it's going to depend on the certain circumstance and the context of the valuation. Context with valuation is always the most important aspect. So what data is available, what is it that you're valuing, then you determine which of those tools you use to value that property.
And what are the different ways of valuing intellectual property?
So there's 3 basic approaches. You have an income approach, which is essentially what is the revenues, the future revenues or earnings that can be generated from an asset. You discount that. It's called a discounted cash flow analysis. Bring it to a value, those future revenues to value in today's terms. Second approach is the cost approach. Cost is, it's very simple. It's how much would it cost to develop an asset. It's very rarely used when it comes to intellectual properties. And then the third approach is the market approach, which looks at, in the marketplace, what do similar assets actually transact for? So what have they sold for? What are values in the real world placed on those similar assets?
And you were retained on behalf of Terry Boulay in this case, correct?
I was, yes.
What were you asked to do?
I was asked to determine how the value of Gawker.com increased as a result of posting the Hulk Hogan sex tape.
And how did you go about doing that?
So there's, in a simple sense, there was three basic things we did. We took a market-based valuation multiple. So we looked at a multiple to determine value. We then looked at the value before Gawker posted the Hulk Hogan sex tape. We looked at the value of Gawker after they took down the sex tape. And then we attributed that value based on the number of viewers to the sex tape page.
And you said you used the market approach, is that right?
That's correct.
Did you consider the other two approaches?
I did. I always consider every approach. But again, context is key when it comes to valuation. So given the context of this case, and one of the first things we do anytime we do evaluations, we have to get a broad sense of what is the information out there. Was there any general indication that posting the sex tape benefited Gawker? And so the first thing we looked at to do that was Google Trends. We use Google Trends to see how does traffic and searches, how does that show any indication of a benefit? Is there any spike you can see based on them posting the Hulk sex tape? So I've actually got a chart that I'd like to pull up if we can.
This chart.
Yes, this chart. And so as you will see here, in October of 2012, immediately after the posting of the Hulk sex tape, there was the highest searches. Now this is Google searches for the term Gawker. And what's important about that is Gawker is their brand. So this increased interest, this increased search for the Gawker brand, that is what drives value.
Okay. And now, did you actually take this spike into consideration in your valuation itself?
The specific data that goes into this is an index. This is to give, again, a big picture. This was not used for the specific calculations, which we are going to get into. But anytime we do evaluation, we have to always step back. You cast a wide net, so to speak, and see what information is out there. And this is an indication that, yes, Gawker did derive value, but no, it did not specifically go into the analysis of the valuation conclusions that I have.
And this ran from this chart that you actually printed this, correct?
I did.
You did the search?
I did.
And this runs through 2012 through, I believe, up through the end of 2013, correct?
That's correct.
Now, in terms of the other two approaches, you selected the market approach. You didn't use the income or the cost approach, correct?
Right.
Okay, why didn't you use the income or the cost approach?
Well, let's get rid of the cost approach first, because the cost approach, it's very rarely used. You're going to use the cost approach if it's an asset that has not been monetized, it's never been brought to the market. It's really a way of saying, if I had to recreate this myself, how much would I spend to create that asset, as opposed to just buying it? It's absolutely not an approach you would use here, and it's an approach we rarely use in intellectual property valuation. Now, the income approach it's a widely used approach, and we use it for many different assets, but when it comes to websites, and specifically a content-driven website, a content-based website like Gawker, the primary indication of value to Gawker is the traffic they are able to drive to their site. It's the viewership, it's the user base. And so the historical income they have generated, whether directly or indirectly, from any post, is not as important as the future value that can be driven off of having an increased amount of traffic and an increased user base.
This is an article that you reviewed in connection with your opinions in this case, correct?
Yes.
And if you could, go to page 2, John. First sentence of the second paragraph. All right, and you just mentioned the word traffic.
Yes.
When you're talking about traffic in this case, what are you talking about?
Yeah, and for simplicity, I call it traffic, but what I'm looking at is monthly unique users, and that's a term we have heard over and over the last 4 or 5 days of trial. But monthly unique users is the specific measure that I used when conducting my valuation.
And you've been sitting in court, and as part of your analysis in this case, you reviewed Mr. Denton's deposition.
I did.
And Mr. Delario's deposition.
I did.
And Mr. Kidder's deposition.
I did.
And is monthly uniques the primary metric that they use for their website?
Well, monthly uniques is used for several reasons. By the one, they pay employee bonuses based on monthly uniques. Mr. Denton himself says that some page views are worth more than others. He talks about the value of uniques. So monthly uniques is absolutely a basis for measuring the value of Gawker. I think Mr. Denton himself also said that the success of their website is based on an increase in uniques, an increase in traffic, and also that success is measured by the brand, the Gawker brand.
And a couple things you just mentioned, John. Just wanted to press on those in this exhibit, which is Exhibit 81, that's been introduced into evidence. Can you pull up that first sentence for me, please, John? Okay, and this is a quote from Mr. Denton from an internal memo.
Right.
And I think you just referenced this, but we all know that some page views are worth more than others. Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah, so if I can elaborate on that. Some page views are worth more than others, but the page views that really have the most value are those that can go viral through social media, Twitter, Facebook, even on television. It's those provocative stories, such as an exclusive celebrity sex tape, a provocative celebrity sex tape of Hulk Hogan, that can drive value. And as I think Mr. Delario even said, this wasn't just boobs.
And I think that you referenced exclusive, John. Can you highlight that next quote for me, please? It says, think of an exclusive. Is that what you were referring to?
Exactly.
Okay. All right, so that was the multiple that you used in this case, is that right?
Correct.
And that's also the multiple that Gawker uses in operating its business, right?
That is the multiple they pay bonuses on. That is the multiple that they use, or that is the measure that they use to measure success.
So once you had decided to use that multiple, what did you do next?
So the next step was to look at comparable websites and determine, we're looking for a valuation multiple. We're taking the market approach in this case. Okay? And again, the market approach is the best approach to use whenever possible. Because it's real active data on real transactions for similar assets. And so what we did is we looked at a broad field of websites and tried to narrow that down and hone that down to what are truly comparable websites to Gawker. And so there was 4 basic criteria that had to be met. And we started off with, again, thousands of sites. And those 4 basic criteria was, A, it had to be a content-based website. So not an e-commerce site like an Amazon who sells products and that's how they generate money. Not the subscription-based site, such as the Wall Street Journal, where you have to pay to actually view the majority of the material there. So it had to be a content-based website. The website had to generate the majority of its revenue through advertising, and then it had to have 2 other things. It had to have verifiable monthly unique user data. Again, the same metric we've been talking about all week. And preferably that data had to come from Quantcast. That's the same source that Gawker uses for all of its own internal analysis. And 4th, it had to have a publicly available valuation from a reputable source. And so based on those 4 criteria, we were able to find 6 websites that we find to be very reasonably comparable to Gawker.com. And I think we have a board for those, right?
Pull that up on the screen.
Can you just check and see if juror number 5 can see that close enough? Because she's kind of looking.
Is that the one you want?
Yeah, that's the one. So I hope everybody can see what's, I'm going to get to this one up here in a second.
Can we see if all of it is breathing 3 feet is reasonable length of resistance? So that's going to raise it up.
How many more resistance, whatever it is.
These two. So the new face of that. So we look to the right hand.
Okay, and I can't see that, but I take it that is the same as what's up on the screen.
Should be on the screen in front of you.
Great. And so what you'll see is, again, we went through the 4 criteria, the objective criteria to determine what are the most comparable sites. So here are the 6 sites that we looked at. And so simply what we have done is we have tried to come up with, and we have come up with, a monthly unique user multiple. And for simplicity's sake, I may start calling this a valuation multiple. Okay, and so that valuation multiple is determined by looking at the company value for each of these 6 sites, and then dividing that by the number of monthly unique users each of those sites have. And that gives us a monthly unique user or valuation multiple for each of those sites. We then look at common statistics, minimum, average, maximum, and to be conservative, we have looked at the minimum multiple as a, what I will call a no less than value, the absolute minimum value. Once we attribute this later on, I'm going to get to this on the next slide. But the average is a most reasonable indication of the true value multiple that should be used when valuing Gawker.com.
And then there's a company value column on this. Can you explain that company value column to the jury?
Sure. So, and I think I alluded to this, but company value is, this is what those companies are actually some of these are publicly traded, it's what they're actually transacting at. So it's what the market has placed the value. Again, this is the market approach. We're looking at what real value for these things is based on a market impression and a market value, real buyers and sellers out there placing value on these companies. And so that's what those company values are, and others of these are taken from reputable sources, but the majority of them came from Capital IQ, which is an S&P company.
Is Capital IQ generally recognized as an authoritative source within your industry?
Absolutely. We use Capital IQ. Most publicly traded companies use Capital IQ. Most valuation houses use Capital IQ. Now there's Capital IQ, there's Bloomberg, there's a couple others that compete, but at the end of the day, they are all aggregators of financial data. They are Capital IQ. Why we use them is they are considered one of the most reputable sources when it comes to financial metrics and financial data.
And once you had selected your comparables, gotten the data on their monthly unique users and their company values, what did you do next?
So after that, we knew the monthly unique user traffic for Gawker over the period of time in question. So this was from September 30, 2012, which was prior to the posting of the sex tape, and April 30th, 2013, when the sex tape was taken down. And so we valued Gawker.com at those 2 dates using this valuation multiple, this monthly unique user multiple. And I think if we put up the next board, and is it okay if I walk up and point to the board? Is that
okay, Your Honor?
based on the comparable websites we looked at, was 19.34. And so simple, very simple. The 19.34 times the monthly unique user traffic that Gawker had at September 30th gives you a value of Gawker.com of about $232 million. Again, that's September 30th. On April 30th, 2013, valuation multiple doesn't change. What changes is the traffic. The traffic increased. So now what I want you to really focus on is this difference in value. The difference in value from September 30th to April 30th is about $54 million. Now, we're not claiming $54 million is all attributable to this. This is what we get into here down. And so we know that there were roughly 5.4 million unique views of the Hope Sex Tape page. And the Hope Sex Tape page was up for 6.71 months. So this gives you an average of approximately 800,000 views of the Hope Sex Tape page over the period of time it was posted on Gawker.com. And just up here, just to show you what finally, the difference in the monthly unique user traffic is approximately 2.8 million before sex tape was posted and after it was taken down. So here what we look at is the change was the 2.8 million for Gawker.com as a whole. 800,000 on a monthly basis is the number that went to the Hope Sex Tape page. So 28.5% of the traffic, of that increase in monthly user traffic, was generated by the Hope Sex Tape page. So at the end here, again, pull this from here, $54 million change in value. 28.5% of that change in value is attributable to the Hope Sex Tape. And that gives you a value of $15.445 million. Now, we also did this on the minimum. Nothing changes on this except for one number. So rather than an average of 19.34, we're looking at a minimum of 6.25. All other calculations we just went through remain the same. And that gives you a minimum value, a minimum benefit Gawker received of approximately $5 million.
And I do want to clarify one thing on this. In the middle of the page, it says average monthly unique views of the video. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. But I think what you're testifying is that that's actually a reference to the page that the video's on, correct?
Correct.
And so, based on your training, your educational background, and your professional experience in this case, what opinions did you reach?
The opinions that I reached are that the value that Gawker benefited, as measured in an increase in value of their website, was at a minimum approximately $5 million, but the true likely value that they got from posting the sex tape was just over $15.4 million.
And did you reach those opinions within a reasonable degree of certainty?
Absolutely.
No further questions now.
Thank you.
Connor, may I approach for a moment, please? Morning, Mr. Anderson.
Good morning, Mr. Berry.
How you doing?
I'm doing well, and I'm glad that your back is feeling better.
Thank you. The last time we were together, I had a little bit of back pain, didn't I?
You did.
So far, so good, but we'll see how I feel this afternoon. Before we get going, I'll do the same thing that I did with Mr. Shun here earlier. I'm going to give you a copy of your transcript. I may give you additional materials as we go along, but I think for what we'll do, we'll be going about a half hour. I think this will be enough to get going. Sure. As we go through some of the documents, I'm going to give you paper copies. So you can just flip them. Sure. Sure. Mr. Anderson, the first thing that you talked about with Mr. Vogt earlier, the first substantive thing that you talked about in your report was some Google Trends data. Do you remember talking about that?
I do.
You showed us, and Tim, if you could bring up Plaintiffs Exhibit 18. This is what you and Mr. Vogt were talking about, right?
That is correct.
And this showed that spike that you were referring to in October 2012.
Right.
But this, I think you said, didn't actually factor into your report, the valuation part, right?
Factored into my report in the sense that, as I said, every project we take, we cast a wide net to begin with, and we have to look at, first of all, is there any indication that there was an increase in value? And so it works into our report in that sense, but in terms of the calculations that we just went through on those boards, no, this data does not factor into that.
So when you got down to the number crunching part of this didn't factor in, right?
When we got to the number crunching, no, this did not factor in.
And this shows, I think you said to Mr. Vogt, this shows a 2-year period between 2012 and then all of 2013?
Correct.
And then there's that large spike, which is, I think you said, the largest, the highest number rate-wise of searches for the term Gawker through Google, right?
Yeah, it's the interest through Google search terms that is driven for the word Gawker. Again, the brand Gawker, this shows that interest on Google, the world's leading search site.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Now on this chart, there's no specific date tied to that big spike, right? There's no date on there, is there?
I don't see a specific date, no.
So you've been sitting here throughout the trial so far, right?
I am.
And there's been a lot of discussions about chronologies, what happened when. So you recall Gawker posted the commentary about the Hulk Hogan sex tape, and it posted that video. That was October 4th, right? 2012.
That is correct.
And you also heard testimony that Mr. Balea filed this lawsuit on October 15th, 2012, right?
That sounds right.
Okay. Why don't we take a look at Defense Exhibit 877? So this is that same Google Trends chart, right? We talked about this at your deposition, right?
We did, yes.
And this, the same screenshot, the same period of time, right?
Yes.
The only difference is it shows where the spike is date-wise, correct?
Yeah, if you're telling me that box that says October 14th to 20th is that dot on the top of the spike, I'm going to believe you on that.
Yeah, and so it shows that the spike occurred for Gawker searches the week of October 14th, 2012, right?
Shortly after the posting of the video, yes.
Shortly after Mr. Balea filed the lawsuit, right?
That may have happened at that time period too.
But, right, you just told me he filed the lawsuit on October 15th?
Yes.
All right. A moment ago when you were talking with Mr. Vogt, you told him that you had your MBA, right?
I am.
You got that degree just 5 years ago, didn't you?
Approximately 5 years ago, yes.
And before you got your MBA, you worked at a branch of Wells Fargo in California, right?
I did.
And then you worked at a place that was called Bridge Bank, also in California?
Yes.
You worked at those companies for a total of 3 years, right?
Yes.
And then you went on and you got your MBA?
That is correct.
And then you went to your current employer, this Consor company, right?
Right.
You went there right after you got your MBA, correct?
That's correct.
And Consor's been the only place that you've worked over those past 5 years since you got your MBA, right?
As I think we talked about in my deposition, there was a little bit of overlap between the prior company I'd worked for before Consor, but for simplicity's sake, yes, for the last 5 years, it's the only company I've worked with.
And at Consor, about half of the work of that company is in expert witness services, right?
About half. We started off as a non-litigation practice service. This is something that we actually fell into just because we're experts in this field, because we actually practice what we preach, so to speak. So we were one of the first companies to actually get involved with licensing. We actually represent licensors and licensees. We have many companies we're working with right now where they're trying to take, whether it's a new technology, a new brand, they're trying to get it out into the market in order to monetize it down the road. So yes, about half is litigation, but the other half is private transactional work where we will have a company come to us. Example, we had Jawbone come to us. They're a headset. Jawbone is a headset and speaker manufacturer, and they were looking to raise money, so they came to Consor and they said, we need a valuation of our entire patent portfolio. And so we helped them, we did the valuation, and they subsequently got the financing they were looking for. So half and half, it's an estimate.
Right, and that history of the company, that happened before you got there, right? Since you've been there.
What history?
About how the company started and that whole story about how it started off in non-litigation things and then moved into expert services. That all happened before you got there. Since you've been there, half of the company's work has been expert witness services, right?
Sure, half of it's been expert witness services, but just to add to that, if I can, is that my role within Consor, I lead the valuation and analytics department. So nearly every single project that comes into Consor, I'm the one that manages the analyst team and gets the project done. And I'm hoping, and I hope the owner of my company is watching, is that the plan and the goal is to someday take over the business. So I would argue that the 26 years of history is something that, as my mentor, he has giving me that knowledge so that I can hopefully carry forward what he has helped to build.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate mentorship, and I'm glad you mentioned him. The fellow that you mentioned there is Wes Anson, right?
Weston Anson.
Weston Anson, I apologize. And he's the one who founded the company?
He did.
Right? And he's your boss now?
He calls me a partner sometimes, but I call him my boss.
Excellent. Now, Mr. Anson wrote a book about testifying as an expert witness, didn't he?
He did.
And he's given you tips on techniques for testifying as a witness, right?
I have not read the entire book, and I probably shouldn't have just said that, but the general gist of the book is tips on how to be an expert witness.
Right, but he personally, though, has also given you tips on testifying as an expert like you are today.
Sure.
And in fact, you took a 2-day class on testifying as a witness, right?
I did.
And that class was part of an expert training course, wasn't it?
It was.
And that course was run by a company, I think the acronym is SEAK, S-E-A-K?
SEAK, yes.
And that's a company that trains expert witnesses, right?
They do training for expert witnesses, yes.
Now, just talking about your actual employment, you've never been employed by a media company, have you?
Media company? I guess it would depend on how you define media company. But
you never got a paycheck from a television station, a radio station, a newspaper, a website company. You've never been employed by a media company.
Never been employed by a media company, but I've done work for media companies. I've done valuations for media companies. I have a general understanding of the media industry. So, but no, I have never gotten a paycheck from, Time Inc. or anything.
Right, and you've never been an officer or director at a media company, have you?
That is correct.
And you've never been the officer or director of any company whose business is devoted to to publishing web-based content, right?
No.
And you've never actually had a job with a content-based website?
Had a job with, I have done work with content-based websites as a consultant for helping value those websites, but in terms of a job, if we're going back to the analogy of a paycheck from Time Inc., no, I have not been paid by a website company, no.
Okay. And we'll talk about your experience with those companies here in just a little bit, and I'll talk
Sure.
about it as we go through some of these other things. Now, earlier you mentioned in talking to Mr. Vogt that there's multiple approaches to valuing an asset, right?
That's correct.
And here you adopted the market approach, right?
I did.
And you didn't look at the cost approach, right?
No.
And you didn't consider the income approach, right?
I always, well,
Well, you did.
I always consider all of the approaches. I always consider, again, going back to the cast a wide net situation, I always consider everything, but when it comes down to experience, judgment, training, you have to then select what is the most appropriate and reasonable methodology. So I considered it, but I determined that no, it was not an accurate approach for valuing Gawker.com.
Right, and so you never ran through the steps you would run through in an income approach analysis.
Never ran through the steps.
Well, let's talk about it a second. The income approach looks at the present value of a company's earnings, right?
Correct.
And so it represents how much money somebody can expect to make off something in the future, right?
That's correct.
And to do that, you look at actual cash flow of companies. You look at revenue, you look at profits, you look at growth rates, right?
Yes.
You didn't do that in this case.
I did not. And again, the reason for that is that, first of all, historically, if you're used an income, you could use an income approach, but the assumptions built into that would have to be wildly inflated because content-based websites, again, the future value monetization potential is key there. And so to do the traditional income approach you're talking about, that is going to be based on such wild assumptions, which are really, at the end of the day, best guesses, that it absolutely would yield a value that is not reasonable, not something that is appropriate.
Right. I think when we talked about this last year, you told me that an income approach would undervalue a website.
If you looked at an income approach for Gawker.com or any other content-based website, yes. Now, one other thing on income approach is that, and this often gets confused, and when we present it to the IRS on valuation and all the CLEs, is oftentimes you're going to hear something called a revenue multiple, or an EBITDA, which is essentially earnings, an earnings multiple. A revenue multiple is not the use of an income approach. A revenue multiple is a form of the market approach, the approach I used. It's just a form of benchmarking, finding some common denominator. And so to use a revenue multiple, which I think you may be alluding to in your question of income approach, absolutely is not an appropriate way to measure the value of a website, such as Gawker.com.
Right, and the bottom line is, and we'll get into some of this in a bit, but the bottom line is, in your view, using that approach would undervalue the website.
Absolutely.
So what you did in your analysis is to use, and I think you explained this a bit earlier, you used this market approach.
I did use a market approach.
And in your report, probably should give you a copy so we have it up there. I apologize. I meant to give this to you earlier.
No problem. Thank you.
All right, so in your report, you pointed to this is the report you wrote for this case, right?
It is, and there was exhibits, and I think the exhibits got sent by accident a day or two later to you. But this is the report minus the exhibits, which were essentially what we walked through. So if we need them, I'll make sure to ask them.
Yeah, and well, at any point, if there's anything that you want to point to, let me know, and we'll
Sure,
go there. In your report, you talk about why you use the market approach, and you pointed to two sources that suggest that this valuation method that you used, that you talked about up here before, was acceptable, right?
Yes.
Tim, would you put up one of those sources? It's Defendant's Exhibit 117. All right, so this is one of those things, right? It's this is one of those sources that you pointed to in your report. It's from a group called Cogent Valuation. Do you see that at the top?
Yes.
And the title there is The Pricing of Online Media. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, this was one of the documents that you said you relied upon as a source for your valuation methodology, right?
Yes.
Okay. In Cogent Valuation, just at the top of the page, that's a valuation firm, right? Much like yours.
I would argue they're different because we specifically deal with intellectual property, but they are valuation.
Right. And this article specifically talks about valuing web companies, correct?
Correct.
Now, I'd like to direct your attention to the third paragraph on the page, the state of internet advertising. Do you see that?
The one that's highlighted?
Yes.
Yes, I do.
So that sentence there that starts that paragraph says, since its public inception 5 years ago, the internet has become the fastest growing medium in history with a current reach of 43.2 million active users. You see that?
I do.
So this article was written just 5 years after the internet's inception, right?
Correct.
How long has the internet been in existence now?
Through today? I mean, are we talking about back when it was set up by the government and it was used only for internal purposes? Are we talking about
for popular purposes? Since you and I were kids, probably about 25 years?
Estimate, sure.
And the internet, at the time that this was written, there were only 43.2 million active users, right?
Yeah.
So the internet now has literally billions of users, doesn't it?
I would think that's a very reasonable statement.
Right, and I can represent to you that Gawker Media's websites have more than 43 million unique users each month. So, I mean, more than the whole internet when this article is written.
Sure.
This article was written in 1999, wasn't it?
Yes,
And the stock market crashed shortly after this article was published, didn't it?
it did.
That was when the dot-com bubble burst, right?
That's right.
So the valuation method that you're using in this case was based on the same thing that this article was talking about 16 or 17 years ago before the bubble burst, right?
It talks about it, but we're using much different data now, and as we just went through with Mr. Chun, the last expert, metrics have changed, tracking has changed. So
Right, but you're basically giving a dollar per unique user, which is exactly what this article suggested, isn't it?
to some extent, yes.
Okay. The second article that you pointed to, and Tim, can you bring up what's Defendant's Exhibit 118? I think it's Plaintiffs Exhibit 90 also. So this is the second article that you point to in your report, right?
It is.
And this article also supports your methodology, correct?
It does.
And this article, just for clarification purposes, is titled Valuation Metrics of Large versus Small Website Acquisitions. You remember looking at this?
Yep.
And this article also suggests that websites can be valued on a per-user basis, right?
It does.
So this article, if you direct your attention right under the headline, that was published on August 27th, 2008, right?
Right?
The next month, the stock market crashed again, didn't it?
It did.
Isn't it possible that the methodology you're using leads to inflated valuations?
If you're asking me if it leads to stock market crashes, then I'm not going to say with an absolute yes that that is the case. Now, maybe inappropriate use of that methodology at wrong times, you could argue it could have some negative effect. But when properly used, I'm not going to sit here and say that the stock market crash was attributable to people valuing websites using monthly unique users.
It's a very fair point, and we'll kind of get back to this throughout the afternoon here. When
I mean, I think this actual crash had a lot more to do with real estate than internet companies.
It's a very fair point. We'll walk through it, and we'll get to this question a little bit later.
Sure.
Now, earlier, well, let me ask you this way. Isn't it a fact that you're not aware of any situation in which a website was valued for commercial purposes based on unique visitors?
So not to get lawyerly here, because I'm not a lawyer, but, you know,
I am.
commercial purposes, please tell me what you mean by that.
Well, I'll ask a more specific question. You're not aware of any loans that have ever been made to a website company based on the kind of analysis that you used in this case, right?
The websites that I have valued in the past, unfortunately, I'm under strict confidentiality agreements on those. I can't get into the details, but something happened after the valuation of our websites, and so, but from a public use, I don't know of any, no.
Well, why don't we talk about your experience and then come back to the question that I actually asked you. When you do your work for valuation, you do these valuations that you talk about, right? You do a valuation, you give it to a client, right?
Sure.
You don't know whether any deal actually closed based on that valuation, do you?
Very, very rarely. And this is standard practice. I mean, you go to any valuation firm, they are not privy to what happens once they... And the purpose of that, very simply, is because we have to remain objective. I mean, our job as experts is to be as objective as possible. We have to give conclusions that are based on sound principles and methodologies. And so once you start crossing that line where the expert then starts to know what the numbers are and the ultimate deal values, it becomes tainted. So no, I don't know that, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of valuation experts that do know that, and if they do, I personally would question why they do.
No, I understand. So, I mean, what I understand what you just said was you don't know what happens with the valuations that you do once they're done. You give it over and have no idea what happens.
I don't know what happens with the valuations we do when we are done, but what I do know is that companies that we do valuations for that then go do deals that I'm not privy to the outcome of those companies come back to us later and have us do other valuations, maybe for a similar reason, maybe for a different reason. So while I don't know the outcome of that, I would assume that, and I hate to assume, but I would assume that because of the work that we did, they're coming back to us because they thought the work that we did was right.
All right, if you would, well, let me come back to my original question, which was, isn't it a fact that you're not aware of any situation in which a website was valued for commercial purposes based on unique visitors?
I do not know specifically any website that was valued based on monthly unique users. I know that websites have been valued using the market approach, and again using benchmarking, which is benchmarking again. It's a measure. It's a common denominator of value. No different from if your house is being valued, you get an appraisal done, and sometimes you'll see price per square foot. It's a benchmark. So you have to find the common denominator that has true value, and the true value to Gawker is monthly unique user traffic through all the litany of things we've already gone through.
But, right, and I don't want to lawyer this down too much, but I do want to answer my question.
Sure.
Here, the benchmark that you used was unique users.
Right.
And so my question is, you are not aware of any situation in which a website was valued for commercial purposes based on unique users, right?
I am not aware of any website being valued, publicly being made available.
You personally are not aware of any situation in which a website was valued for commercial purposes based on unique users as the benchmark, correct?
Okay, again, personally, I am not aware of any website being valued based on monthly unique users where the outcome of that valuation or even the specifics of how that valuation came about was made public. I am not aware of that because, again, typically those things are not made public.
Right. We went through this whole exercise at your deposition as well. And if you could, and I'm happy to go through it with you again. On page 104.
Sure. Of 104 of my deposition?
Yes, please.
I am there.
Okay. And I asked you, starting on line 5. You see where I'm at?
Yes.
Has Consor ever valued a website using the market multiple of average unique viewers where the website has actually sold for that amount? Your answer: I don't know what happens after our evaluation. We're typically not filled in on the results of our advisor reports. It's that's not typical. So that's what you were saying before, right?
I stand by that statement, yes.
And then I asked the next question. Are you aware of any situation where Consor has ever valued a website using the approach that you used in this case, where that value was actually awarded as damages in litigation? The answer: again, when it comes to outcomes of cases, I wish I knew the answers to some of them. I don't know. Next question. Outside the work that Consor has done, over the past 5 years, are you aware of any situation in which a website was valued for commercial purposes based on unique visitors? Same question I'm asking now. You responded with the same question. For commercial purposes? What do you mean? So we got into it. For sales, like the sale of a website. Mr. Anderson, let me ask just a more specific question than the sort of general ones
Sure.
we've talked about. Isn't it true that you don't know of any other instance in which your methodology was used to assess the increase in a company's value attributed to a single web post?
I don't know that.
You're not aware of any other situation in which your methodology has been used to assess the value of a post like you're doing in this case, right?
I haven't heard of any specific examples of that, but again, these are odd cases. I mean, it's a different case, and so I've used the same methodology. You see, in valuation and what we do, and we have to value, sometimes we have to value entire companies. We just got done with a case where we had to testify in Paris because Chevron, their trademark was taken, and I'm not trying to do this to you, but I think it's important, and I hope it explains your answer.
It helps a bit.
Yeah, I think it gives some broader background on this, where Chevron's trademark was taken from them by the country of Ecuador. And so Chevron had to sue the country of Ecuador, and so we had to value the business within Ecuador and then apportion some value of that to the trademark. And so every job that we do, and we've done, I don't even know, probably hundreds of these projects I have managed valuing intellectual property. Every single one of them has an aspect of attribution. Because if you're looking at an intellectual property, it is one piece of the larger puzzle of a company as a whole. And so while I don't know specifically of anybody taking one post and valuing it to a whole website, what I can tell you is that every job we do has to do with attributing value to some larger whole. That's the business that we're in.
I understand, and I appreciate the explanation, but the bottom line is you're not aware of any situation, not even one, where your methodology has been used to assess the value of a web post, right? The bottom line, you're not aware of a single instance.
I'm not aware of a single instance.
Thank you. That'd be a good place to break.
Thank you. So why don't we go